Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session on understanding how to trade in sweets and snacks in this region, reviewing the advantages that the FTA brings. I mean, sweet and snacks surround us on a daily basis. You're snacking on something as you watch the TV, you are having dessert, you're having a biscuit, but you never really think about the arduous journey that you may have taken for these products to have reached your nice, comfortable sofa. So we are trying now to reach out to you to explain to you some of the hoops that these snacks and sweets have to go through in able to reach you. And for the businesses then who are keen to expand their markets, to be aware of these issues so that they then know how to allow more of us to enjoy more products in sweets and snacks. We have two experts with us today, Deborah Elms from Asian Trade Center. She's been speaking a lot of these issues for a very long time, and she's going to take us through step by step on what is the advantage of using the FTA in terms of a cost savings advantage if you're trading under the FTA. Then we are very fortunate to have a practitioner, somebody who's actually using the FTAs to trade on her products, is chocolates. And she will then share what are the issues to note out for so that the rest of you who are thinking of expanding your products beyond your own domestic market can take attention to. Before I hand over to Deb, I'd just like to continue to say, so sweets and snacks, why is it so difficult to export to certain markets? So we all know the issue is that sweets and snacks it's not the final product itself, but it's the ingredients that go into it. It's your milk, it's your sugar, it's the cocoa. Sometimes it's the rice flour that goes into the products. And because these basic ingredients are being protected in a lot of countries because they are trying to look after, in their view, what works best to help their own farmers. And so because of this, then there's a lot of high tariffs, a lot of protection is given because they're also trying to balance the two between the welfare to their own industry as well as to meet the free trade aspirations that their own industry also has, because their industry also would like to export, and for them to export out they also then need to give and take to have some imports coming in. So these are the key issues to note of, and as you're thinking about how you're going to expand your market in sweets and snacks, we are focusing hopefully on 2 or 3 of the FTAs. I know Deb is going to be focusing on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which will hopefully come into force next year. It is an FTA with 15 countries, ASEAN 10, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, and China. We also have the CPTPP. In the CPTPP, I have to say that I was one of the market access negotiators, and I know, therefore, from my experience, how difficult it was to open up the area that Connie is trading in, chocolates, primarily because it contains a lot of sugar. So let's just say if you're very health conscious and you're exporting things with no sugar, hardly any milk, but means very tasteless to the consumer, it is easier for you to export your product. I also discovered during these negotiations that if your product contains rice flour, even if it's dog biscuits, it's going to be hard to export into Japan because they protect the whole rice supply chain. So these are just some of the things that exporters and manufacturers need to be aware of, because sometimes just changing your product a little bit may allow you to enter the market a bit easier. Again, as I said, for chocolates, it depends on the amount of sugar and milk is there. And for other products, it just seems how you're going to tweak it. So you need to be aware of the classification. You need then to be aware of what is the market access customs duties, and then assess how the FTA improves your marketability, because your buyer in the country may not need to pay that high customs duties, and therefore gives you a competitive advantage when you're entering that area. So I will stop for here now. I will just hand the floor over to Deborah, who can take us through some of the practical points to note on this topic. Deborah, over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me quickly, there we go. Let me just go through a couple of slides. I'm going to talk about what the RCEP agreement means for sweets and snacks. And the reason I'm going to focus on RCEP is, first of all, it's complicated. But second, because it is a new set of opportunities for companies in Asia to start designing, selling, retailing products in Asia for Asia. Now, there are some challenges around that, as I'll show you in just a moment. But I think this is one area that you should pay attention to. As Liz noted, we are hoping that RCEP comes into force at the end of this year, beginning of next year. And so there's only a few months, frankly, for you to get ready to think about what the benefits might be in RCEP for your particular products, and then to be prepared to use this agreement on the first day. Because for some products, as you'll see in just a moment, the benefits happen on the very first day of the agreement. And I think for many companies, then if you're not prepared to use this agreement, you're leaving money on the table. And for firms that are trying to survive COVID, you know, every dollar, every dime really counts. So you want to make sure that you're ready on day one. So let me just describe some of the challenges, though, in RCEP. We have 15 countries. And although we have a lot of trade agreements in Asia, we did not have an agreement that brought together these 15 countries. The challenge with getting an agreement done, though, with 15 major markets, is that not all of them were equally enthusiastic about opening their markets to one another. And you'll see in just a second where some of that variation comes in. The net result of that for trade in goods, like sweets and snacks, is that it's a bit complicated. So we have tariffs that vary across the 15 markets. The reduction times vary across those 15 markets. And at the end of the day, there are actually 37 different tariff schedules that you might have to look through. That can be a bit challenging for firms. And so I encourage all of you to seek out advice, specialist advice, to use software companies to help you with this particular process, especially if you have a large inventory of products. What is useful, though, before you all lose hope, is that you're going to get, or likely to get, reduced tariffs for most of the products that you want to sell in Asia, and that the rules for doing so are much more simplified than they used to be. So rather than having to deal with multiple different ways to qualify for lower tariffs, in the case of Asia, we had 5 existing agreements. That drops to 1, and there's 1 rule of origin. So once you manufacture a cookie or a biscuit to meet the RCEP rule of origin, then you do not need to shift out ingredients. You don't need to change sugar. You don't need to switch out chips or whatever. You can ship it without change into all 15 markets. And for many companies, that is also a huge cost savings. So once we have 1 certificate of origin, you manufacture it to meet RCEP standards, then you can ship it without change. And there will be faster processing at customs, which of course matters to all of you. So as Liz just said, you know, your sector can be challenging, and it faces often higher barriers than fresh and frozen food. That's because of this issue around ingredients. It's also because governments like to have higher value processing take place domestically. So there are often one relatively low tariff for something like a raw material like raw coffee beans. When you grind those up, you often face a higher tariff as the value gets added. And then when you ship a bottled coffee beverage, that can have an extremely high tariff, you know, 40 to 45% for bottled coffee beverages is common. And so there are real obstacles to moving products around. And I'm really interested to have someone who does chocolate on this call, because that happens to be one of the worst sectors in terms of hitting all of the highlights of the sensitive products, dairy, sugar, chocolate, in one item. So let me talk about what does this mean then for one kind of product. So let's look at cookies or biscuits, sweet biscuits. You can see here on the left some of the key countries in Asia, in RCEP in Asia. The base tariff in the middle is the tariff rate that your products pay if there are no benefits in place right now. So as just a regular garden variety exporter to these countries in the region, your tariff rates range from 8 to 20% on cookies and biscuits. That's a very high tariff. And so what you want out of a trade agreement mostly is to have a reduction in that tariff level, preferably all the way to 0. And that column on the right then shows you what is the tariff benefits coming from within RCEP. And you can see that most, but not all, of the countries that I've highlighted here will have tariff reductions. Some of them are significant and substantial and fast. And in particular, I would point to Thailand and the Philippines, which dropped 20 and 15% tariffs on biscuits and cookie to 0 on the very first day of this agreement. I think that's very fantastic. It means that there may be new market opportunities for you in Thailand and the Philippines, where your products may have been uncompetitive in the past, but could now become quite competitive if you take advantage of RCEP, and your competitors who are still paying 20 or 15% tariffs are not paying attention to RCEP. Not all of the benefits are that awesome for sweets and biscuits. Some of them drop over very long time horizons. So you can see that for some reason, the Chinese do not like Australian and New Zealand cookies. And they've told them it will take 20 years before they have access at zero tariffs to the Chinese market. Compared to ASEAN, Japan, and Korea, which is dropping a little bit faster, but still 15-year timelines. This is very long. Now that's better than what the Japanese gave the Koreans and the Chinese, where they said, we're not changing anything in RCEP. So there's no benefits coming for sweets and cookies. There are benefits in other areas, but not for sweets and cookies. And the point of this chart is just to say that there are benefits that are embedded in RCEP, even for a complicated sector like making sweets and biscuits. But you need to be very careful about how you look through this, and you need to be prepared to exploit market opportunities in some places sooner than others. So in some places you get zero tariffs overnight, and in some places you have to wait 20 years, and in some, generally not for ASEAN itself, but in some markets, particularly the Japanese, the Koreans, and sometimes the Chinese, they like to keep things unchanged forever. This is what a tariff schedule looks like. I just want to highlight it for you so then you can see that it's all done by HS codes, which is the product categories on the left. It describes what the product is, and then it tells you the base rate, which is the rate that you are paying now with no benefits, no FTA benefits in place, and then what happens every year after that to that tariff, so that you can go through the schedules yourselves and look at what those look like. They are all available online under the RCEP tariff schedules for the RCEP text. So you can see all of this right now, even before the agreement comes into force. I'm going to skip through 2 slides here and just talk very briefly about one other area that matters a lot for companies, which is how do I qualify for those lower tariffs? Not every bag or box of biscuits and cookies will qualify for RCEP. You have to meet the rules of origin. You have to be RCEP qualifying. And how do you do that? Fortunately for cookies and biscuits, the rule of origin is relatively simple. In fact, there are 2 ways that you can qualify. One is if you change the tariff heading. So it was flour, sugar, dairy, whatever, and it becomes a biscuit, and it changes at the 4-digit level. Those of you who are in supply chains will know what I'm talking about, and the rest of you can contact us after this. Changes at the 4-digit level. So relatively easy to meet. The second way that the cookies and biscuits can qualify is if they have 40% of the content from 15 markets in RCEP. So as long as 40% of the content, the material, the value of those ingredients, and the production is done in RCEP, then you qualify as an RCEP biscuit or cookie, and you can potentially get lower tariffs across the region. So there are 2 parts of this you have to look at. What are the tariff savings that I'm eligible for? And then does my product qualify for that? And in general, what RCEP does, and this is my last slide, what RCEP does is it provides a description for every single product. What is it that you need to do to qualify? And so you can see at the bottom of this particular one is the cookies and biscuits, and that's where you see the CTH or RBC 40 on the far side, which tells you what is the rule of origin that my products have to clear in order to benefit from whatever are the lower tariff savings on offer in this agreement. And so I think that's very helpful for firms to know, and that again can be found on the text and schedules. So you will know ahead of time what is the rule of origin that I need to know, and then what are the tariff savings that come attached to that, and do I need to remanufacture? Am I perfectly set up as I am? How can I best take advantage of RCEP? And so I'm delighted to have everybody paying attention today, because you have only 6 months-ish before this agreement comes into force, and those companies that are prepared and ready will be saving money and will be gaining new market opportunities that firms that are not paying attention will not have. So to increase your competitiveness, I'm delighted that everyone is here, and I'm happy to answer questions that you may have shortly. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deb, for a very good overview and strong stressing to everybody as to what preparation they need to do to take advantage of the FTA, because as you rightly pointed out, your current production pattern, if it doesn't meet the origin criteria, you will not qualify. And then somebody else, your competitor who's making the effort to follow and prepare and do all this, will take a better part of the market share. So it's very important to everyone that's listening in to do your homework, to prepare, to know what you need to tweak, if anything, in your current sourcing or production patterns, depending on the FTA that you're wanting to enter into. So Deborah has already set up what you need to do if you want to enter into the RCEP agreement, which hopefully will enter into force early next year. It might be also good for those who are already seeking to do business in this region to take a look at the pre-existing agreements that Deb referred to, because, you know, RCEP builds on. So as she had pointed out, is one common rule book for all 15. Unfortunately, in the past, there were separate rule books for, let's say, ASEAN and Japan, and then another rule for ASEAN and China, another rule for ASEAN and Korea. But it may bear looking into these other rule books, because they have already been in force for many years, and the staging component may already be moving to a certain extent that may be more competitive than what RCEP does. But RCEP has the benefit of saying it's the same rule book. So your rules of origin is very important for you all to compare as you assess whether to use one of the earlier FTAs or whether to start really preparing so that you can use your shipment then should be ready to go so that your first shipment out benefits. And this means, and then this is the part I think all of us who are the trade negotiators often overlook, you'll need to find the right buyer. It's no use just exporting, because you need to have a purchase order. You need to know who you're selling it to. You need to know how to convince the buyer in the other country that it's best to buy from you because you can meet the origin criteria and therefore give your buyer a customs duties saving and therefore give you a competitive price advantage in that way. So thank you very much, Deb, for highlighting the key points that companies need to look into. As Deb said, we are ready to take questions at the end of the session, so you can start sending in your questions now and we will look at it later. So without further ado, let me turn to Connie, who is actually using the FTAs and has some real life practical advice also to give to all of you to take note of as you also enter into this sweet and snacks market. Over to you, Connie.
Hi everyone, maybe I would just want to explain what kind of business I'm in so that how it will be practical for you. So let me just share it now. Okay, can everybody see? Okay, so very simply that I'm a manufacturer of chocolate, and we are supplying to industry like ice cream, biscuit, confectionery, bakery, and HoReCa. At the moment, I'm selling to 50 countries. As a practitioner and a beneficiary of FTA, I want to show you some of the highlights countries that I'm enjoying now. So let's talk about the countries that are listed in this slide: India, Korea, Thailand, China, Philippines, Australia, USA. So I always use interchangeably with two different types of FTA, one mainly with the ASEAN, with the country like ASEAN with India, or ASEAN with Korea, or actually Singapore with the country directly. So I have been enjoying right now these countries, particularly like India, from 30. Actually, I'm not paying any more duty because it's real chocolate. So the devil is in the details. Because just now, as Deborah, I'm just really happy that you have this RCEP, and a few more countries I'm looking for so many years. Is really one of the 15. And we are, yes, in the sugar arena, we are very disadvantaged. But however, we are vegetarian. So-called, we don't have animal inside the product, makes us really easy. To me, I think I'm enjoying because we are a direct product like a vegetarian that most countries could easily accept only the duty paid. But you can see from this slide that I provided now, like Korea, Thailand, China, Philippines, I haven't been paying duty, and it's been wonderful. So look at China, it's a little bit very different. It's a different country. Like actually, USA is not even charging any duty on chocolates except product from China. So people who have a factory in China trying to sell that into USA, they actually pay a 7.5% duty. So this is my stand as a Singaporean manufacturing company. So let me just start on, are you export ready? Most of our SMEs, most of the companies here, they couldn't do it successfully because, first of all, they probably don't even know their goods eligibility, which I mentioned about whether it's animal product or the vegetarian product, and how competitive we are. And especially you mentioned about HS code, we really have to find out the most appropriate or the most accurate HS code that will give us less or no problem at the customs. And we are talking about the raw material, local content. So as our chocolate, we've been selling to more than 50 countries, except one continent that I cannot sell to is actually EU. The reason because they have a huge penalty on the sugar, because it is a protected industry, because they're not talking about just duty. They actually want to slap you with penalty. So it's like another level of collecting higher duty. And of course, what kind of value added, and also what kind of experience and knowledge that you have in those dedicated markets. And okay, let me move on. Okay, number one, we have to determine the relevant FTAs, because really Singapore doesn't produce anything from the ground. So even our raw material that we buy has to be already a value added. So this is something that we must be very sure. Otherwise, this can be also a huge problem when you start to submit a cost statement. And of course, the HS code, even like for myself, okay, I'm doing chocolates. Everybody knows we have dark, milk, and white chocolate. But I also fall into a confectionery of the white compound where there's actually no chocolate content. And that also gives us a lot of experience over the last 18 years about customs looking at your product. You talk about white chocolate compound, what is that? Is it a hard candy confectionery or just a confectionery? So this one is actually the basic before you were talking about applying all the rules of origin. And just now we also have clearly mentioned about what kind of value added content. And finally is how to do a qualifying FTA based on the RO with the highest tariff savings. So for my, okay, this is a website that I find it very useful. First of all, get to know your own product and go into this statement, to go into this website and to look into the cost statement. Actually, customs has been very helpful. You submit once and they actually will even give you a call to check out how you actually make it possible. And all the time, my people has already a good contact with this authority to see, look, we are genuine, we are really we are having a value added and manufacturing here, but this is something that we are not sure. They will actually even advise you. All right, maybe over here, take a good look. How do we do this sample of a cost statement? So this is for the public. First of all, we have to mention clearly what kind of cost and what you expect from Singapore Customs. This is the cost statement when you're successful. So clearly to show what you actually apply for, item by item. So this is what we always get as a cost statement. All right, and we also have one area that we are enjoying a lot now is that we can even do self-certification under the AWC, and we just by putting that in your invoice, you can see that the exporter of the product is covered by this document. By having this one, actually like what we do, be exporting to Malaysia, this document is already enough to cross the customs. But before doing that, we also have a lot more preparation, which is what I'm doing that. You see, so again, with all this self-certification scheme, don't just declare without knowing the in and outs. So this is where we actually did this carefully, then we can do a proper declaration, because at any time, actually customs do call up. I want to verify the documents because this is the reputation of our country. And this is where we always can fulfill. That's why customs over there will have very good records. And this is where you have a smooth export too. And okay, maybe I think in all good things, I have been enjoying a lot of tariff savings. But again, we do have a lot of challenges because, as I said, for the white chocolate and the white compound, different country, different port, even in the same country, may give you a problem. So wrong declaration will result in not able to clear your customs, and it can cost you a lot of money for detention and even a lot of duty penalty imposed. And this can even be clawed back for many years. So this is my experience in India and China. So now I have one case where I've always been declaring, let's say in the chapter 17 on confectionery. And later on when China customs says, look, why are you in 1704? Why are you not in 21? So these, you have to be prepared where you have a lot of documents to support your case in order to avoid any slap of duty years later. And also get to know your customer's port. Different ports really give you different challenges. I will just mention India. I love Shiva. It was quite straightforward, but when I come to Chennai port, they will actually slap you with other rules like Karota. So this is my day-to-day challenges. So please get to know your importer. Otherwise, it will be a lot more other challenges which you want to avoid. And for Japan, it has been a very protective country for processed food. So we haven't been enjoying huge tariff saving, but we still do when you read into the details like changing your packaging. That will actually help you a lot. And finally, for the FTA with EU, where they only allow, just I should mention earlier, they only allow maybe on the ethnic ingredients or without sugar, things that they want to protect. So you just have to be very clear before you can export or when you do your costing with the customers. Okay, so I have done my part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Connie, for giving those insights as to what the company needs to do. So if I may just seek your indulgence, one of the first things that I think a company needs to do is to decide which market you're going to want to export to, find a right buyer. Would you say then that it's better to find a buyer who is a bit more experienced in this area, because you noticed that there was a lot of customs challenges involved, and so it's better to find somebody who's already got that relationship, understands how to do these things to make it easier for you as the exporter? Do you have any advice on this?
Yes, the knowledge of the market and the people that we work with is utterly important. But however, being a Singapore country, being a small company in Singapore, I think a lot of us don't have a choice. So you need to help your customer, because customers have choices. They have local customers, they have so many other countries that also exporting, just like example China. They have a lot of choices. Instead of just buying chocolates from Singapore, they could also buy chocolates from Europe. So European, EU doesn't include Switzerland, but Switzerland itself is a standalone country where they enjoy a lot of free tariff. So really, that will be a good advice that you get a good importer. But I think we have to do our part because we are the seller. We really want to help them. We don't want them to stuck. Otherwise, it will be like first time or probably the last time. So my advice is that you must be equipped with knowledge. That is even more important.
Thank you very much, Connie. So both Deborah and Connie have very nicely stressed the importance of what I would just term doing your preparatory homework. You need to be aware the market, what the challenges are, and as Connie said, you need to learn to help yourself so that the buyer will want to buy from you and not from somebody else. So this, I think, is very important. And so what aspects of the FTA can you then also cite to say what gives you the competitive advantage so that the buyer will benefit from buying from you than from somebody who's not able to benefit or tap onto the FTA benefits. If I can just turn to Deborah for a little bit. So Deborah, on this common rule book, do you see any other advantages coming vis-a-vis using a regional FTA compared to using a bilateral FTA? Do you have any advice for our companies out there?
I think that there are fortunately in Singapore, we have a lot of FTAs, you know, and hats off to MTI for all of its work in creating these. But bilateral FTAs can be hard to use because they typically require, let's think about the 40% content as an example. They require that 40% of the content come from FTA partners. And if there's only 2 countries, one of which is Singapore, then, and we don't produce much of anything in Singapore, you need to make sure that 40% of the content comes from the other side, whoever that happens to be. That can actually be very hard because there's only 2 places in which you can source materials, ingredients, and add value in order to take advantage of the benefits. So bilaterals can have useful benefits, and if you're structured in the right way, then fantastic. But what we find with a lot of companies is that they actually are sourcing from more than that one partner country. And for them to try to reformulate to fit a bilateral agreement only is difficult, can be expensive. And if the benefits are not significant enough in that market, then it's not worth doing. So the advantage of these bigger deals, either the ASEAN agreements, RCEP with all of Asia, CPTPP, which includes also wealthy markets like Canada and Mexico, those can be very helpful because not only are you selling to a much bigger customer base in those bigger agreements, but you're also able to source raw materials and components and so forth from that larger group in order to qualify for export into that larger setting. And so in general, while we have lots of bilateral agreements and they can be very helpful, it is much easier for companies if you have larger regional agreements. It's easier to find markets, it's easier to find customers, but it's also easier to find suppliers and sourcing. And then the last thing that I would say is that from a compliance point of view, if you're using a larger regional agreement, it can be less expensive and less risky for you because you're training people to use one agreement and they do one set of paperwork and they understand what those rules are as compared to trying to switch. So you'll note that one of the things that's made the chocolate company so successful is that they use a lot of different agreements, which is, you know, hats off to you. And clearly there are benefits from doing so for your sector because 0 tariffs gives you a price competitive advantage over others. But you also have to be very careful about all of the compliance on your end and the paperwork and the training of your staff, the sourcing of your ingredients, and making sure that you are always within the rules. That can be expensive and difficult. So that's why these regional agreements tend to be better, just because it makes the cost and the risk less for you as a company.
Thank you very much, Deb. I think from my point as a negotiator, the other observation I've made is that usually in bilateral agreements, especially where it involves just Singapore and the other party, if the other party is protecting their agriculture sector, it becomes very, very difficult for Singapore to open up that sector because we are already duty-free and they perceive it as very little trade-off. Whereas if you're in a regional agreement, because they see there are more benefits from the other partners, you usually get a better deal at the end of the day. And this is also on your point on rules of origin. One takeaway that I have, and feel free, Deb and Connie, to elaborate on this as well, is that when you're using the RVC criteria, you're subject to a lot of price fluctuation issues, especially when you're importing the raw materials. Sometimes you may hit the criteria, sometimes you may not. There's exchange rate issues and all that. So sometimes an alternative criteria, like what Deborah pointed out, the tariff shift may work better, but not all of our FTAs have a tariff shift alternative. A lot of them just have a regional value content. So this is another point that I will urge potential players in this sector to be very clear on, what is the rules of origin criteria, how much of a buffer or whatever do they have when they use the regional value content, because I mean, it includes the calculation of profits, but you know, profits are very thin margin these days. And so it is just something to bear in mind. And so if Connie and Deb would like to add on this point, I open the floor to you as well. Deb, maybe I can start with you since I'm looking at you first.
Sure. So, you know, I think there are a couple challenges with RVC. I mean, RVC requires that you keep a very careful record of your costs, that you submit cost documents to customs, and that you are aware, especially if you're near the edge. So, you know, 40% is the threshold and your product is at 38, 42, maybe 50, but kind of closer to that threshold than you would like, can be difficult. So you have to have all that documentation that Connie was discussing. You need to share that with customs. And depending on which customs gets that documentation, there's always a risk for companies that that documentation will end up in a competitor's hands. So some companies dislike RVC rules because they're worried about sharing that information, collecting it. They have to confirm it. You know, customs will come and say, show me your production processes. Let me make sure that you're actually adding the right amount of whatever the ingredient was. It can be very, very challenging, which is why sometimes, as Liz mentioned, the tariff shift is easier because it was a something. It was flour and eggs and milk, and it's become a biscuit. And if it makes that jump, then we don't have to argue over how much of the value is embedded in the final biscuit. We just say it was this. It's now that, it qualifies, done. And for many companies, that is so much easier. And it also may not matter where those materials come from. They can be from anywhere. They can be Brazilian eggs and European flour and, you know, whatever. You can put it all together and make your biscuit and still qualify as an RCEP biscuit or an ASEAN biscuit or Singapore biscuit. That can be very helpful for companies because it gives you more sourcing opportunities. And it makes you, again, be at less risk of being out of compliance. Because the problem with many of these FTAs is that if you are caught not following the rules, the fines, the fees, and the penalties, as Connie noted, can be significant and they can be retroactive. So make sure that you do your homework, make sure that you keep the documentation, and you need to keep that documentation internally for years. So I encourage companies, if you're not already doing this, please get software to help you with this, because otherwise, you know, you've got it on Excel spreadsheets, you've got it on a napkin stored somewhere, and then, you know, like 5 years later, someone asks you about a shipment, you're in trouble. So keep your documentation, get it online, make sure it's digital. A lot of the new software programs actually help you sort out FTA certificates on the spot. You don't even have to really do much. So I think there are solutions to this, and I just would urge you to pay attention to the rules, because if you're out of compliance, it can be deeply, deeply expensive.
Thanks very much, Deb. Connie, would you have anything else to add from your own experiences?
Yes. Okay. So just clearly mention the major transformation is very so-called straightforward, and it's so clear that we have added value enough to get the product. That is where so far I have no problem on that, because there's a major transformation. But there's a lot of companies probably buying chocolate to mold into chocolate. Then the little value added may not be able to do so. So please support a lot on the local, we call it local content in the sense that you buy a local product that already produced. Like for me, I buy like cocoa butter, which is also from Singapore factory. I already had that. There's no way that Singapore produces cocoa, but cocoa butter is already a huge process. And this is called local content, or the local content of the country that you want to import to, like Australia. Australia has been very clear in their FTA rule. You need at least a product that is made in Australia. Let's say if you want to sell to Australia, and most chocolates are being exported to Australia, like milk chocolate, then try to buy Australian milk. So this is called the local content, which one of my advice. And usually before we talk about FTA, let's step back one step. A lot of people could not actually export successfully. It's not because they couldn't meet the cost statement. They really did not have a lot of compliance on the certificates. You know, the last time when we attended the seminar at our Singapore Food Agency, which has a very good, or used to be called the AVA, has a very good reputation. So when they give you the authority, or when you apply for authority, that will actually a very basic document that the importing customs want to see. It is not because when they reject you, they probably don't give you an answer, they don't give you a reason. But the thing is also the compliance certificates, where we have to really get ourselves right. Not only the cost on the FTA that we want to enjoy the tariff, but at the same time, ensure that you can do it very successfully. Otherwise, actually, there are really too much details, and customs won't really tell you. I mean, the importing customs may not want to share with you a lot. It could be just other little details that we most of our companies have missed out. This is all I want to share.
No, that's very, very useful, Connie, because you have nicely also brought us to the fact that trading in these products is not just an issue of tariffs and rules of origin, but there are also the standards and the quality that needs to be met, because, you know, these are consumables. So every country wants to make sure that what their citizens are consuming are safe for them. And so therefore, these health issue, the compliant, making sure that is issued by reputable authority, making sure that you know how to meet this criteria is also very, very important when you're dealing with all these consumable products. So thank you for raising that point as well, so that I would advise our listeners to, as you're listening to this, to start to think about what is the checklist that you need to do as part of your preparatory homework if you want to enter into this market, or if you're already in this market but not aware of the FTA benefits, also then look at how you can qualify, do your necessary homework. Compliance is very, very critical here. You know, some of our FTAs allow for the alternate rule, but some of our FTAs only have an RVC criteria. So as Deborah then said, for that aspect, please do very good record keeping, because if there's an on-site verification which is allowed under the FTA for the importing customs authorities to check that really your documentation is accurate and not false, as soon as they find something which is wrong, they will investigate a whole range over years of your exports to find out what else you may have cheated on. So to be, in their views, cheated on. So to be very, very careful, do the compliance. And if you are on the margins, be very, very clear about how you import it. And then Connie's excellent advice is that if you can source local, help your fellow local in your own supply chain for the production of this product, because that's what also happens. Because this FTA is not just about your final manufacturer, which is, I use Connie as example, the chocolate, but for all the ingredients which are going into the production, and how can you then help this supply chain, where it be domestically as much as possible, so that you don't run into a foul, especially if you're using the RVC, or within your whole network, who is it that you're working with, and who under this common playbook will therefore help. And so it is a win-win situation for a few companies and not just for the one company. As we are reaching the end of our discussion point, before we move into question and answer, can I just ask both Deborah and Connie, what will be your key advice to give to our listeners as they enter into this sector? Connie, may I start with you?
Okay, have to be very focused on the market that you want. Do one at a time, so that the risk will be minimized, and then with the experience you can go on more. So that we don't start with just 10 countries, we start with one by one. So this is my takeaway for today. Get to know your market.
Thank you very much, Connie. Very, very practical. Deborah?
Well, I'll just build on that. And I would say that you pick your first market, and it shouldn't be the most complicated one. So we have so many companies, especially small Singaporean companies, who say, I want to sell to the US. Really, good luck to you. Like, that is not an easy market to break into. So I would say, like, pick your targets and make it realistic. So where do I think my products can be sold? What are the market niche that I need to fill that's not being filled by someone else? What can I deliver to that market that they haven't seen before? But be realistic. You are not going to go from purely domestic sales to being an export powerhouse in the United States or Europe overnight. You need to build your way up to that. And so, you know, pick those first markets with some care and get specialist advice. A lot of it is free and available in Singapore, which I think is great. You have great agencies and institutions that will help you, associations, other companies who've made this journey. Use their advice, because they will help you decide what are the right markets, what's the right timeline, what do I need to think about, what are cautions that I need to be aware of. Use other people's knowledge so that you don't make a huge and expensive mistake.
Thank you very much. My takeaway from this sector, as somebody who loves to indulge in sweets and snacks as I'm watching TV, is that find how to make yourself a niche name in your own market first. Because if you're already doing very well in your own domestic market, that means people know who you are. It may be also easier for them because, we are talking about the FTA benefits, which come once you're a known entity, because you're already trading, you're already exporting. So as Connie said, what do you need to even do for normal trading and exporting? How do you find your normal buyer, and then how do you take advantage of the FTA? So as somebody who has been sampling a lot of sweets and confectionery as part of my work as well, as we try and advise companies what to do, make sure that you are already very well accepted domestically. So put in that effort. I would say, from my point of view, that it may not be the best way to start as an exporter, but start doing it domestically first. Know what the palate is of your consumer, because there are a lot of local sweets and snacks in Singapore, which we haven't touched upon today, but you're living in Singapore, there's a lot of that. And so if you're going to try that and export this, you need to make sure that the market you choose also understands your product, so that there is a ready market to consume your product, and then you can see how the FTA gives you the additional cost savings advantages in this area. So I'd like to thank both my speakers. We will be moving to address questions and answers that you may have sent to us. So thank you very much until we move into that session.